Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming along tonight to hear about the work Victor Harbor Council has been doing to look into changes happening along its coastline and how these changes may impact the community, the natural environment and built assets such as homes, roads and other infrastructure. My name is Nicole Halsey, I'm from URPS and I'll be facilitating tonight's webinar. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on tonight and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as mentioned, this is a webinar format which will comprise a combination of presentations with the opportunity to ask questions. And the way to do that is to use the little button at the bottom of your screen along the toolbar which says Q&A. And at any time during the session, please type in a question or a comment. And at key points in the webinar, I'll pause and throw those questions or comments to the project team. We are recording tonight's session and we will be making the recording available on Council's Your Say website on the 13th of May. So if you do miss something tonight or someone you know missed out, please tell them that it will be available for viewing. Also, given it's a webinar format, for those people who may not be familiar, you won't be able to see or hear yourself and you'll see presentation slides and hear from the project team, but you won't hear from other people online. And just in case you're interested, we've got 4 people online with us at the moment. We had 8 registrations, but of course, given we've got some weeks of viewing online, we're not worried by that at all. So let me introduce you to the project team who's here with me tonight. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Lee Jeffrey, and she's from the City of Victor. Thanks very much, Lee, to give you a wave. Lee is Council's Environmental Project Officer and has been heading up the Coastal Adaptation Project. Sitting with Lee tonight, we also have Kathy Hayter from the City of Victor Harbor, and Kathy is the Director of Environment and Infrastructure. Thanks, Kathy. And then finally, we have Mark Weston from Integrated Coasts, and Mark is the consultant who has been engaged by Council to undertake the Coastal Adaptation Study. So why are we gathered here tonight? Tonight is really an opportunity for you to hear about the key findings of the Coastal Adaptation Study that has been undertaken by Council with Mark's assistance. And this study forms the first stage of a 2-stage process by Council. Stage 1 has been all about understanding what has been happening along the Victor Harbor coast, what assets are located there, such as roads or pathways or buildings, and how changes in climate might impact those into the future as a result of sea level rise. The second stage, which we're yet to commence, involves preparing the coastal adaptation strategy itself. And this strategy will help Council, the community and other stakeholders plan for the future. And that strategy process is important, as even though we're thinking about changes that might happen in the long time as a result of climate change, such as sea level rise, we still need to think about them now and plan for them now so we can make appropriate decisions in the shorter term. So many of the decisions, for example, we make today, such as resurfacing a roadway or a pathway or building a new building, they last for many years in that location and they might be impacted by sea level rise in the future. So we need to think about those changes in the shorter term as well as the longer term. So now over to tonight's webinar. It will involve 2 key parts really. Firstly, Mark will do an overview presentation about key coastal concepts and terms that will help understand some of the key findings of the study. And we'll pause there at the end of that section for any questions or comments. We'll then move into a series of 3 shorter presentations, again ended at each one with the opportunity for questions, which will talk about key findings of the adaptation study in relation to 3 key cells or localities along the coast. A reminder that at any time during the presentation, please feel free to type in a comment or a question. I will come to those at the appropriate moment. But on that note, Mark, I'm going to hand over to you to talk to us about key coastal concepts.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And I'll just share my screen. And I think we're right to go. Yes,
all
thanks
good to go.
Good. Thanks very much for the opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing in the Victor Harbor region and what a great region it is to work in. And I have a long-term connection with Victor Harbor, as we had a holiday house in the Yulki area for nearly 40 years. I just sold it. So I'm certainly glad to be working in that area. Just a word about the team. I've been doing this sort of work now for nearly 10 years around the state, mostly for councils and some work for the state government. And you can see my contributions to this project listed here. We've also had Professor Patrick Hesk on the team. He's a head of the Flinders University, head of environmental sciences at Flinders University. And he's what's known as a coastal geomorphologist, which is just a fancy word for someone who understands how coasts are formed and how they change over time. And he certainly must be regarded as an expert when it comes to the movement of sand around coasts. Professor Bob Borman's retired now, but he also lends a hand to this sort of project. And he is a geologist as well as a geomorphologist. And I think he must be regarded as possibly one of the world experts, especially in the Fleurieu Peninsula. Most of his professional life has been concentrating in that particular region. Now, as Nicole said, this is a two-stage project. And so tonight we are looking at the Coastal Adaptation Study. And this is a study about what we know about the coast already, about some of the storm activity, about the nature of the coast, and about how sea level rise might impact the coast in forward years. And of course, after we finish this stage one, we'll be moving into stage two. As Nicole said, we'll break this into two main parts. I'm going to put down a little bit of time for the key coastal adaptation concepts, just so that you understand how the study is put together. And if you happen to flick through the reports, we'll give you a better insight. We'll break the second part up into three sections related to these particular locations, Hayborough, Mccracken, Encounter Bay, and we'll finish off Victor Harbour Central. And as Nicole said, we'll take questions periodically throughout the presentation. So first of all, some key coastal adaptation concepts. And what we have done for this project is adopted what we call a conceptual framework. And this is simply about how we're going to think about the problem. So when we think about coastal hazards, we're really only considering two in this project, and there's inundation or sea flooding and erosion. Now, the South Australian Coast Protection Board does consider one further one, which is sand drift, but that's not of concern in this particular location. So we're only considering two here. But when we consider the nature and severity of a coastal hazard, we're really consider it in two main concepts. On the one hand, we have the fabric or the geology upon which our settlements are situated, which we drive around and we live. And on the other hand, we have exposure. In this case, the waves, tides, and the currents. So let's just take an example. Let's say I was to take you up to Port Adelaide headland, and it might be a windy and stormy day, and we could say, wow, it really feels exposed up here. We can hear those waves and the wind howling. But then we look around, also note that we're on elevated land, but it's very resistant to erosion, being granite. And so overall, even though the exposure is high, the coastal hazard to the settlements at Port Elliot in that location would be quite low. And of course, we could go all around the state. I could take you up to some areas in the Upper Gulf, which are low lying and have sandy fabric and various exposure ratings. But I think you get the idea that it's the combination of these two that dictate the nature and severity of the coastal hazard. Now, as humans, wherever we go, we do tend to modify things, and so coastlines are no exception. And so often we find that the fabric of a coastline has been altered or modified. One of the best examples I think we have is the Adelaide Metropolitan coastline, which our four fathers and mothers built along on a former sand dune system. And when the storms came in the 1950s and pulled out the sand dunes, it became really obvious as to the nature of the fabric in this location, and it had to be modified to rock all the way along. This is not dissimilar to Victor Harbour in some ways. This is a very old photo from 1866 Victor Harbour, and this is the area down here which we now have the visitor centre and various roads and car parks. And really this whole area here has been modified from a sandy sand dune environment to something that has urban structures upon it. And so finally, in this little conceptual framework, we don't want this just to be an academic or a scientific only exercise, but we want to know what is the impact of the coastal hazards upon public assets, private assets, We're calling this social disruption, and this has really two main concepts taken from the Council's risk management framework. And one of those is public safety, and normally we consider that more perhaps in the relationship with inundation, flooding, but the second one is community concern, so how the community may react to emerging coastal problems. The final area we're looking at is ecosystem disruption, and this has really quite a more of a broader concept. So imagine we had some low-lying land that might be freshwater, and so if we had sea level rise and seawater start to flow into that freshwater ecology, then it would be significantly disrupted. So that's what we're talking about there. Now, over the last few thousand years or more, 4,000 to 5,000 years, sea level has been reasonably static, and this relationship between fabric and exposure has been quite static as well. But if seas rise as projected over this course of this century and beyond, then we can certainly expect this relationship will change between fabric and exposure. So we're just going to have a quick look at about how we're going to take into account sea level rise. And a quick history lesson. It's generally conceded that seas began to rise in the mid-1800s, some would say perhaps a little bit earlier, probably due to the fact that we came out as a globe from a colder period known as a little ice age. But the general consensus is that increasing greenhouse gas emissions are also causing warming, and where we have warming, we also have sea level rise in association with that. Now, so sea level since over the last century rose on average 1.7 millimetres per year. And of course, you understand that just is an average. Nature doesn't work on averages. And so sometimes it was much faster than that, and sometimes it was slower. After 1990, the federal government put some tide gauges around Australia. They're called the sea frame gauges, which does stand for something. And I think there were 13 originally, there's 12 now. And the gauges in our area were running at about 4 to 5 millimetres per year. So it's roughly 4 millimetres now since 1990. I quite like this graphic because it does show that sea level is not necessarily an easy thing to pin down. And you can see up here that in the upper areas of Australia, sea level is actually running a lot faster. But in the area we're looking at here, there's a sea frame gauge at Thevenard, and you can see that this is actually running 4 to 5 millimetres. But also we've had satellites have been gathering data since 1993, and there's a reasonable amount of correlation between those to show that that's about the rate of rise we are experiencing at the moment. So when we're considering moving on to looking to the future, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I'll affectionately from here call the IPCC because it's easier. The IPCC has been meeting since around 1990. They meet every about 4 years. And in the 2013-14 meeting, they developed 4 greenhouse gas scenarios. You can see across the top here, from the very low greenhouse gas to the very high greenhouse gas. And associated with that are some projections related to sea level rise. And I'll just mention here too, I have this information came from Coastal Adapt, which is a really good website. If you want a good resource that's written in plain English, you can use Coastal Adapt, and that's where we are drawing some of our work from tonight. The first glance at this is actually over the course of this century that we can actually see there's a huge range of outcomes or possible outcomes. And the second thing we notice is that most of the escalation takes place in the second half of the century. So, for example, we took the 4 greenhouse gas scenarios and compared them. At 2030, there's only 1 centimetre difference between all of them. If we took the projections at 2050, and we're just talking about the core ones here, not all these shaded areas, there's only 4 centimetres between all of those. So we'll say all that to say one of the problems we do face from a decision-making point of view is that adaptation, in the context of adaptation, is that projected sea level rises do not accelerate until the second half of the century. So that makes decision-making a little bit tricky in the coastal zone. Now, I'm just showing here the very high greenhouse gas scenario for a reason and superimposing these allowances on the graph there. And these are the amounts set by the South Australian Coast Protection Board, which has been operating since the 70s. And our state government, I believe, was one of the first, if not the first in the world, to incorporate sea level rise parameters into planning. And so you can see from this here that effectively the South Australian Coast Protection Board has adopted sea level rise parameters that are now in line with the very high greenhouse gas scenario. Now, of course, that means we are taking a conservative view or a pessimistic outlook, but I think this is wholly appropriate in the fact that we're dealing with high levels of uncertainty. And as Nicole said, we're talking about infrastructure, houses, and we need to have long time frames and take a somewhat precautionary view of the sea level rise issue. So just the final section of this section, just look at some of the purpose of the Coastal Adaptation Study. First of all, we want to create a baseline upon which to monitor future changes. And so what do I mean by that? Well, take, for example, an aerial photograph from 2018. I have here plotted on this photograph the position of the shoreline. And now we could, in the future, get a photograph of 2021, 2025, 2030, and we can compare what happens to that shoreline over time. Because if sea levels rise, then of course shorelines will recede. So that's one way we can establish a baseline as a point to compare, make future comparisons. But we've also got aerial photography back to 1949. And so this is actually a key thing we do in this project. Is actually to work out how's the shoreline been acting over the last 70 years. So this is a baseline in the sense we're looking at the state of the system. And the more we can understand how it's operating now, the more we'll have clearer information to make good decisions in the future. There's another way we can do baseline studies, and that is using digital terrain models. And Council has two of these, one for 2011 and one for 2018. And later in this presentation, I'll show you how we're using those to make comparisons about changes in the shoreline. The next thing we're looking at doing is create flood mapping to identify plausible futures. And I'm using that word from Coastal Adapt rather than, we don't like to put out predictions as such, but just to map out what could be a plausible future over the course of this century. Again, a couple of key terms. If you're a fisher person, then you would deal in tide charts, which we call tide chart datum. But in this project, we're dealing with Australian height datum. That's what your surveyor would deal with. So as for an example, the 9th of May 2016 was the highest event on record at Victor Harbour tide gauge. And conveniently, it was 2.22 metres CD, or chart datum. But that converted is 1.64 AHD. And so if you're struggling to work out what we're talking about tonight, in AHD, just add about half a metre or 0.6 to the numbers I'm giving you, and then that will give you the conversion to your more familiar chart data. Now we are going to model two events we have modelled, and the first one is a 1 in 100 year average return interval, so a little bit more terminology. But just quite simply, this is the rare event. This is on the basis of probability. We're talking about this only happening once every 100 years. And this event, again, is also used for planning, because if we're going to have roads or houses that have long lifespans, then we use the 1 in 100 year average return interval event. And you can see I've plotted this storm surge event, we call it, the rare event for 2020 around the Bluff boat ramp. So this is 2020. The storm surge with another 300 millimetres of sea level rise would overtop Franklin Parade, and certainly by 2100 would have a quite significant inundation in an event such as this. We're also looking at routine high water events. These are events that we've calculated already occur a few times a month. And so why do we want to do this event? Because, as I mentioned before, extreme events occur very rarely and shorelines do recover. But in the context of sea level rise, routine tidal events are likely to cause more permanent recession of the coastline. So that's why we're looking at those as well. We want to look at key coastal issues and vulnerabilities. We want to provide a risk assessment for each coastal cell or minor cell. And we're using 3 cells here, and you may be wondering why they're numbered 10, 11 and 12. And that's because we've adopted the cells from the state government coastal conservation cells, which you can find on Nature Maps website. And we've also divided the coast into minor cells as well, so we can have a bit of a finer grain look. And then we also want to provide a base for ongoing coastal adaptation planning. And in particular, as we mentioned before, we'll be going into the second part of this project. So in summary, what we're wanting to do in this first part initially is we've done an adaptation study. We've assessed risks and vulnerabilities and we've established a baseline. And in the next stage, and really this is going to go on for, this next stage will go on for years and decades and even centuries, we'll be looking at our options and how we could take some action if required. The outbooks from the project, there's one major study report. The 3 cell reports are probably where you want to go if you're looking for a particular location. These are standalone reports that are written in plain English and highly visual. So hopefully you'll be able to have a look at those and get something from those reports as well. So I'll just stop sharing and see if Nicole wants to say anything. Nicole is not there.
I'm coming. Sorry, I'm just having an issue. Hi, I'm back. Thanks, Mark. And we don't have any questions or comments at the moment. So again, a reminder, folks, to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type anything at any time. But perhaps I'll just follow on from that while Mark grabs a quick glass of water. To remind you as well, in addition to the study reports that are available online, there are also a series of fact sheets that relate to each cell. So if you, again, are looking for some easy to understand and read information about the study findings, go to those. They're available on the website as well. So yes, a reminder, please, at any stage during the webinar, if you have a question or a comment, please let us know and I'll continue to monitor those. But now, Mark, we're going to move into the findings, I guess, on a cell-by-cell basis, and we're going to start with Mccracken Hayborough. So I'll let you share your screen again and take it from there.
Okay, I've got to find my spot now. Should be here.
Yep, you're on.
Cool. All right, let's move into the key findings and we'll do it in cell-by-cell basis. Just a reminder, we are using a conceptual framework in which to look at the various aspects of the study. So we'll look at the fabric, we'll look at the nature of the fabric, how humans have intervened, shoreline changes and profile change I'll explain in a moment. Also some matters about historical storms. We're going to model routine high water and model storm surge events as well. So firstly, Mccracken Hayborough. This cell extends from the High Marsh River to the eastern border of council near the Investigator car park and covers those 2 suburbs there. It's probably a good idea just to look at some of the Dr. Bob's work, but the position of the current coastline has been determined by the swells that wrap around the much older and harder granite outcrops and islands that have interacted with the soft sediments of the Victor Harbor coastline. So it's actually these granite outcrops here that actually have determined the shape of the coastline as the swells have interacted with those. In geological terms, the coastline of Victor Harbor is very young. Even when we look at the area of interest here, if you're familiar with the area, you'll notice some rocky outcrops at Hayborough and Kyneton, and these also help to form the shape of the coastline here. We have what's called a marine bench, which is which was formed the last time the Earth was completely free of ice, and upon which the train line is now situated. We'll have a look at that in a moment. When we look at the benthic, we're actually looking at the sea floor, and this area has some sand near the coast, but is quite dominated by reefs, which is the brown section, and seagrass beds as well. The water is quite shallow, and the coastline here is quite sheltered by Victor Harbor and Granite Island. And so the wave, there's not a lot of wave energy in here, and it certainly decreases towards Hindmarsh River as well. When we move on to looking at the nature of the coastal fabric and how it's been modified, of course, the train line is the main issue here, which was installed in 1864 along this former marine bench and now divides the shore in 2. Private assets, and really mostly council assets back here too, are set a long way back from the shoreline in an elevated position. We have minor assets in the coastal zone, places where people, like pedestrian access points. There is a really old retaining wall, which was put in a very long time ago, presumably to protect the embankment from which the train runs. And we have a few stormwater outlets as well, some which are also old and quite in poor repair. So just moving on to the shoreline changes. So I'm not going to show you Hayborough, we'll just look at Mccracken because they're both similar, just for time's sake. But as we go back to 1949, we can see that the shoreline was quite different here. Sometimes the High Marsh River did used to exit at this point, but even here you can see that it was actually becoming more a dune or a dune system. And also we also noticed that the shoreline has actually accreted, or accreted means it's built out over time. So this is a positive thing that's happened in this particular area. This is a photograph in 1976, and you can just see that the vegetation is building up nicely, mostly or partly, I would think, because of the policy of the Coast Protection Board and all the great work the councils and volunteers have done actually since that time. The 70s, 80s and 90s has been a great time all around the state really for increasing vegetation and dune stability. This is 1999, and we come to 2010, and then 2014, and then finally 2018 is where we are currently. So this location actually has been a very stable part of the coast for over a 70-year period. As I said, it has accreted, which means it's built out, and it's got increasing vegetation cover as well. And there's minimal evidence of wave attack from storms. So we move over to the other side of our equation, that is the coastal exposure. And this is routine high water, which of course you'd expect is not making too much of an impact because it is a routine event at the moment. And just a couple of things to point out. We have three different colours of blue. The dark blue is the tide height of the Victor Harbour tide gauge. The mid blue is what we call wave setup. And if you've ever been surfing or swimming in surf, and you see that big wave coming that breaks, and then you think, oh no, I'm going to get pummeled by all the white water. That's what we call wave setup. And of course, if you happen to be walking down the beach and you have that wave run up the beach and you have to jump and skip to get out of the wave, well, that's what we're talking about, wave run up. And so, of course, the energy of the wave is dissipating or is reducing as it goes up the beach. This area through here is probably not flooded. It's not likely to be flooded in this event. It's just, this is quite simple modelling, but it certainly does give us a bit of an insight. Also, just to mention, this is a stormwater outlet, and so you can see even now that the stormwater tends to lower the sand on the beach, and so of course this will be a place that will first be come under threat from sea level rise. So this is routine high water at 2050, and certainly by 2100 we'll be having some significant impact on that dune system, and that would cause recession. This is the storm surge at 2020, which will also have quite a large impact, but in this era it's likely that the dune would rebuild or some repairs could be done if required. But as we move forward, a combination of storm surges and the routine tides we talked about before certainly is going to have quite an impact upon this, this dune system. It's also important to note that we recognise in this project that we are taking future exposure and we are superimposing that on existing fabric. Well, that's the only way we can do the study, but it certainly gives us a bit of a visual and perhaps an understanding of how the future may unfold. Professor Hess, Pat, we'll call him Patrick from here, uses a number of methodologies to work out possible recession. And this is not as much as perhaps we might first think. About 10 to 20 minutes of recession, but that's also related to the low energy waves in this area, which I mentioned before. But certainly would recede back to the train line. So when we look at the hazard impacts and risks, I have a couple of things here about the fabric and the exposure. You can read those as I'm talking if you like. But just the nature of the coastal hazard here is going to be predominantly erosion because of the slope of the shoreline at the back. So the coastal hazard in relation to public assets, of course, we've got the train line, we've got beach access points. As far as the train line, if this shoreline had no train line, it was just a natural shoreline, if the seas rose, then this whole shoreline would move backwards and maintain its shape. But because there is a hold point on the top, what tends to happen is the slope gets steeper and steeper and steeper, and eventually this becomes unstable and falls into the sea. I'm sure that's not going to happen. That won't be allowed to happen, but that's what would happen if nothing was done. So moving across to private assets, we don't see any impact on private assets. Social disruption is likely minimal, perhaps a little bit of disruption due to the fact that beach accesses are more harder to maintain. And ecosystem disruption, will certainly be some loss of dune and vegetation. And if there were these locations were habitats for shore nesting birds, then certainly we could see this being disrupted and perhaps lost. So in summary of the Mccracken Hayborough Cell 10, we have done an inherent hazard rating, which I'm not going to talk too much about tonight, but that's just about how this coast actually stacks up in the context of the whole state. But looking at the hazard rating here, we can see that at the moment everything is low and no risk really to private assets, but the private infrastructure becomes extreme. This is the future outlook of 2100, and some medium perhaps risk in relation to the other two items here. So in summary, this coastal area has been very stable over time. The key human intervention is the train line, which is owned by the state government, and other public and private assets are set well back from the coastline. Post 2050, if seas rise projected, then the shoreline will recede, which will place the train line under threat. Also post 2050, we are talking about towards the end of the century, it will be increasingly difficult to manage beach access points and stormwater outlets. Broad-scale ecosystem is a disruption is unlikely, but as we've mentioned, there would certainly be some loss of dunes and impact on shore nesting birds. So that is actually the conclusion of Mccracken Hayborough, and I guess we may not have questions. That's fine. We can move straight on, Nicole, if you want to do that.
That's fine, Mark. Thanks for that. And yes, we don't have any questions or comments at the moment. So I do encourage you, if you have anything you'd like to share with us, please do. While Mark's just taking a quick break, I would remind you that the consultation on the study runs to the 28th of May. So you've still got a good few weeks to digest the study, the reports, have a look at the fact sheets, but also complete the online feedback form. And I just wanted to note, Mark, there was a comment, and this may be something more for Lee and Kathy. Someone's just noted that the train line is private infrastructure owned by the steam ranger on state government land. So thanks very much for that clarification. Right.
Yeah, I did actually do a little bit of research on that, actually for the Alexandrina project. So maybe I've got that slightly wrong, but that's good to know. We can certainly correct that in the reports and do.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. And thanks to that person. Thank you for clarifying that online. Yeah. All right, Mark, we might move on. And if you like, in between the sections, you can just continue to share your screen rather than keep trying to find your slides. If that's easier for you.
Yeah. So
and again, people, please let us know any questions or comments.
Okay. Just find my spot again.
No worries.
Taking me back to my current slide.
Yep, you're up and running.
Okay, good. Let's move on to Encounter Bay then. And so this cell runs from the boat ramp at the Bluff around to Kent Reserve, and we've divided it at Tabernacle Road. Those who know this area well, and I do because we had a house down this area, and I have fished in some of these nice little white patches there. But you will know, of course, this area is dominated by offshore rock shore platforms, reefs and seagrass beds. And additionally, it's quite shallow water in here. It's sheltered by the Bluff. And so the combination of all these means that the energy of the waves from the Southern Ocean is reduced by the time the waves reach the shore. It's probably important to note that if we do have 1 metre of sea level rise, then that would mean that these waves would reach the shoreline with greater energy than present. When we think about the geology, Dr. Bob informs us that the low-lying areas of the Victor Harbour were formed quite recently. About 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, seas were 1 metre higher and as they fell to their current position, they stranded the floodplains of Encounter Lakes and formed a bench on which Franklin Parade is situated. So, of course, that's a bit of an interesting point to note that when seas were 1 metre higher, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, we are now headed back to with projections of 1 metre of sea level rise. When we think about the way the coastal fabric is modified, looking at some early interventions, the first intervention came in the form of Franklin Parade, which would have been put 100 feet from the high water mark according to the South Australian Act. My research shows that I believe the Franklin Parade is probably in about the same position, albeit a little bit wider now. It's probably worth noting here that the shore profile is in these pictures seems to be like a very slow sloping shore back up to the road. And we'll come back to that in a moment and have a look at perhaps how that shore profile has changed. Now, storms are were known in this time period as well. And one early one in 1943 saw that actually Franklin Parade was undermined, had to be closed to traffic. So after this, the council constructed a seawall in 1947. And in 1953, they had another storm that virtually wiped out that whole seawall and had to be replaced in 1954. And you can see some of the remnant of that seawall there. So we say all that to say, the storms were known back then and councils of the community were dealing with this issue a long time ago. Later interventions came in the widening of Franklin Parade. The Encounter Bikeway was installed in the 1990s, and we have various car parks that are either widened or installed. And in the back shore here, we have quite a bit of this is now protected with rock or concrete blocks. It's probably worth noting here that if sea levels rise and we're looking at a natural shoreline, then these would naturally recede. Those beaches that have room to recede would tend to maintain their existing profile and sand levels. But those that can't recede because of intervention like this will tend to lose sand levels from their beaches. So urban settlements that are placed too close to shorelines do impose a rigidity in the back shores, which were formerly flexible and could cope with the natural cycles of accretion and erosion. And again, if we look at our shore profile, it's really changed a little bit into this form. So we have a much wider section at the top. And of course, this is where we're starting to get a little bit of impact in this particular area here with various storms that may occur. This is just a quick shot of the later interventions in the area to the east of Tabernacle Road, and we'll just move straight on. When we look at the shoreline changes, I'm actually picking out here Kent Reserve to make a point, but you can see here I have the photograph from 2012 and the shoreline position is 2018. So we can actually see through here that there has been some recession over this time period. In fact, you may recall I mentioned about the digital elevation models, how we've compared those. So this is comparing 2011 digital elevation model to 2018, and you can see the same thing here has occurred. In this modelling, there's been some erosion here. So the question we need to ask is, well, what's going on here? Is this a long-term, perhaps emerging erosion trend? Is this to do with sea level rise? What may be the story? And so this is why I think it's really important for us to get the really big picture. Because if we go back to 1949, we can actually see this shoreline was sitting a long way landwards of where it is today. And in fact, it's actually accreted or built out 45 metres in that particular time. And you can see here when we go to 76, we go to 1989, that it's slowly been building out. And in 1999 is a bit of a crucial time period, because this was the time the mouth of the Inland River was realigned in 1995 and rock training walls introduced. Now we're going to look at this in the next cell, but there was quite a large amount of erosion on the Esplanade Beach. And one of the theories was that the rock training walls that were introduced stopped the sand flow coming past, and then sand was actually building up in this area as a result. I think what we can clearly see from the data is that this has been accreting a long time before the rock training walls were installed. So I say all that to say, it's really important that as much as possible we can understand how the coast has been operating over time. So I think the more we understand this, the better our decision making will be. And I think I've just said that in that little slide there. That's why we want to establish a baseline understanding. Here I have a yellow line drawn, and that represents a Coast Protection Board profile line, a beach shore profile line. And there's about 10 of these around the Victor Harbour area, and they have been monitored or surveyed since the 1970s. And so they also give us an idea what's happening along the coast. So here I have an example of that one. And the best way to imagine this is actually trying to stretch it out because it looks a little bit hard to understand. But if you stretch it out and made about 5 times the width, then it would actually look more like a coast. But here we have the reefs that are offshore. And here we can see how the shoreline, as I pointed out in the photography, has altered also. This was 2009 and it's gone back here to 2018. We've analysed quite a few of these, I think 6, and so I'm only just going to give you one here as an example. We can have a look at the end of Tabernacle Road. This is 1979. There was virtually no dune system then, and I remember this period because it's about the time we bought our holiday house. I remember the water actually coming almost up to Franklin Parade. But you can see here by 2008, this is built out. There's quite a bit of vegetation and more sand. Not sure, perhaps this is also related to council intervention or volunteers perhaps doing some work here as well. There's nothing in the records, but we can see here in 2021 that some of that's gone back, and especially in this area here, just recently it eroded back quite quickly and it's now protected. But you can see there's not a lot of difference here to here over this 40-year period. So what we can say is we can observe is a natural cycle of erosion and accretion that takes place over decades. And you can see it also when we look at the digital elevation models. This is the area that's eroded and this area at the same time has accreted. Let's move on to the other side of our conceptual framework and think about coastal exposure. There are some early storm events, as I've mentioned one earlier, but there does seem to be an increase in amount of storm events that are mentioned in the archive starting from the 1990s. And perhaps the reason for this is that, as I said before, the story of this coastline is one of cycles of erosion accretion. But overall, since 1990, increasing protection has been required. So this may be due to installation of extra infrastructure in the backshore. As I mentioned before, perhaps we have more of a slope back here in former times, and now the extra infrastructure means that waves are interacting more here. And I think we could safely say there's been substantial sea level rise over the last 150 years, and perhaps even increased sea level rise since 1990 might be having an impact here. And we've also had a recent cycle of increased storming, which I'll talk about in a moment. I've only modelled one area here, and this is obviously I'm picking out the worst area, so bear that in mind. This is the routine high water for 2020, which understandably is not showing overtopping, although I did meet a nice lady down the end of Whalers Road one evening who said that she often stands there and watches the waves overtop in that area already. This is routine high water in 2050, which certainly would be doing some overtopping. And routine high water in 2100 would have some significant impact across the top there. Looking at the storm surge in 2020, this would probably do some damage, but again, that could be repaired because it's a one-off event. But certainly when we start to get to 2050, when we're adding 300 millimetres of sea level, and 2100 again looks quite ominous as far as what the impact of that particular event. Again, it's a good time to remind ourselves that we are looking, are taking a somewhat conservative, pessimistic view by allowing 1 metre of sea level rise, which is on the upper end of all the scenarios. But again, I think it's a wise thing to do in the context of planning for infrastructures over long periods of time. Now, shoreline recession in this area, the work by Patrick was very, very difficult to do. And what we do when we do this shoreline erosion in this context is to assume there's no infrastructure in the back shore. So we simply ask the question, what would the coast want to do in its natural state if seas rose by 1 metre as projected? We came up with, or Patrick came up with, quite a broad range of recession estimates. And unfortunately, that's just science. Sometimes it's not as definitive as you like. We'd just rather be honest and say it was quite hard to do this recession analysis, but we do think we'd be looking at least 40 to 50 metres of recession by 2100. However, of course, we know this beach can't recede, and so the impact and overtopping would increase substantially, and sand levels are likely lower on the beach, and the beach may be lost over time. So when we consider our hazard impacts and risk in this area, again, our major one is erosion as a coastal hazard, but certainly inundation becomes a bit more prominent towards the latter half of the century. And public assets, we could safely say that Flinders Parade and the bike track would come under increasing pressure post-2050, as would the car parks. And again, it's probably just worth noting that the impact has really been felt in this area here with the embankment. And just as an example, this has had to be upgraded. This has had to be installed reasonably recently. Private assets are not going to be hugely impacted, I don't think, in the early stages, but post-2050, we saw before in the inundations, potentially there'll be some water going across the top. But we're not talking about great depths of flood here. We're talking about water flowing around houses. Not perhaps nice, but it's also probably not a great depth. Social disruption, I think, is going to be greater in this cell because if people perceive a loss of the beach and the impact on road and houses over time, and again, we are predominantly talking about post-2050, this is going to be a greater concern. And ecosystem disruption, most of the shore is quite urbanised, but areas like Kent Reserve, we could lose some dune. Some vegetation, of course, that would have impact shore nesting bird habitats as well. So in summary, we have, we'll just look at these two. Hazard impacts, in fact, I just put this little circle in this morning because I decided really this is a medium risk because we're already getting some impact upon public infrastructure. But in the long-term outlook, we would say extreme outlook for the public infrastructure by 2100 and these other areas as I've indicated here. So the key points are here, cycles of erosion and accretion take place over years and decades. Infrastructure has been placed in back shores that were once flexible and more able to adapt to these cycles. And so we've actually changed the profile of the beach or the back shore. Sea flooding and erosion events occurred in the early years, but there seems to be an escalation in the need for protection since the 1990s. If seas rise as projected by 2050, then protection items are likely to be required for most of Encounter Bay. And again, if seas rise as projected post-2050, it will be increasingly difficult to maintain protection, to keep sand levels on the beach and to prevent significant overtopping. So that's the conclusion of Encounter Bay. Nicole, did you want to just... Yep.
Yeah. So we've actually had a question online for you, Mark. Would you envisage an erosion interaction between storm events with the High Marsh River outflow and tidal storm surges?
The High Marsh River or the Inman River? It
says the High Marsh River outflow.
Okay. So I haven't modelled the High Marsh River tonight. I'm going to show the Inman River. We did model the High Marsh River that showed that there's a little bit more work to be done there. So it is protected on the right-hand side with, there's a little suburb there, it must be Mccracken, I think. But it is actually protected with a big levee and also a big retaining wall. So we don't think that would be flooded. There would be a little bit of flooding in the upper area where we see some ecosystem disruption. But if the question is related to would there be a confluence of events with a lot of rainwater coming down in the context of sea level rise, that hasn't been assessed in this study. We've only looked at seawater flooding. Apparently there is another study out there, I'm not sure Lee will be able to say this, that does exist. It's actually looked at the flooding of the high marsh and also in the context of sea level rise.
Alrighty, thanks, Mark. Again, a reminder, everyone, please enter your comments or questions as we move through. So we're going to move to our final cell now with Mark. That's the Victor Central.
Sure, let's move on to it. Okay, Victor Central is probably the most complex, as you can imagine, because it has the most urban structures. But that actually is positioned between Kent Reserve and the High Marsh River. And we've divided this into two minor cells, as you can see on the screen. Again, it's probably worth remembering that the current shape of the coastline, which is soft sediment, has been dictated by the way waves have bent and refracted around Granite Island over the last several thousand years. And you can see them on this side as well. In fact, Dr. Bob tells us the very existence of this sand spit is likely related to the waves, the way the waves approach from opposite directions. Again, the low-lying areas of Victor Harbour were formed quite recently, about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Seas were 1 metre higher, and as they fell to their current position, they stranded the grey-black floodplains upon which Victor Harbour is built and formed the sand spit at the causeway. And so you can see through here, if you look at the legend here, there's also beach sand, and this is also a former dune. And this is evident when we look at some of the early photographs. This is 1866. You can see this area down here was essentially the sand spit, but all these dunes through here as well. You may not have known this, but in 1868, these sand dunes were almost into water reserve. And this cutting that was put through, it's up near the Winter Sun Motel in 1967, showed that underneath effectively was an older sand dune. Dr. Bob also says there are no hard resistant rocks near to the surface on the Victor Harbour lowland. They are all buried at depth. And we're not trying to be alarmist here, but just simply to note, and I've said this a couple of times to Dr. Bob, look, this is a road or this is accreted. And he goes, well, what do you expect? It's a sand spit and sand dunes. And so it's expected they would be moving around even without the influence of sea level rise. Again, if we look at the benthic underwater, so we have large areas of seagrass. We have some low profile reefs as well. And again, the energy of the swells from the Southern Ocean are reduced by the time they get to the shore because it is a protected area. And again, just to remind ourselves that if seas do rise by 1 metre, then it certainly would mean that these waves would reach the shore with greater energy than present, which needs to be factored in over the coming decades as we monitor and see what happens with sea level rise. The early interventions, this is a photograph from 1908, which is probably one of my favourite of the whole set. But of course, the breakwater was the first major intervention, and Dr. Bob tells us this probably changed the angular refraction of waves around here and probably eroded this area a little bit. And early establishment was 60 metres back from the shoreline, which was a good thing. Just a quick case study on the history of the Flinders Parade. This is the beach scene in 1910. In about the location of the bowling club, and you can see there's a little dune here. Well, in 1920, or just prior to this, this was the end of the First World War, and people were looking for a place to mourn their loss. And so it was decided to have the Soldiers Memorial Gardens, and the planner at the time was Charles Reed, who also planned Colonelite Gardens. But he made it quite clear in a public address to people at Victor Harbour that you would need this seawall installed if these gardens were to be viable, because water was already going across the top in that particular era. So we just say that to say this was always a very low-lying area. Just keep an eye on that pine tree, because that also comes up over the next few slides. So there's quite a a large amount of storm activity in the 1920s to 1940s, which we'll go back to and look at in a moment. But as far as the seawall, it was fairly, the archives are very silent to the 1970s when all of a sudden it needed to be repaired. And it was repaired in 75, and this pine tree was retained with a box there. At the same time, it was recognised that sand was being lost from the beach. So the sand of 3,000 cubic metres were put into this area in March 1976. And 4 months later, all that sand was gone. Then in the 80s, there was a very large storm that destroyed the seawall completely. And then after that, there was a rock rock revetment placed in. And this is after another storm that just shows the debris that comes across the top. You can see this also in the profile line, that originally this is where the seawall was, and then this rock revetment has moved forward into the coastal zone. So protection items that are placed in the back shores, they may halt erosion or prevent overtopping in the short term. But if seas rise as projected, then sand loss is likely to occur, and the beach may be lost and protection items undermined. And this is probably a good time to acknowledge the work of Coast Care, who've been monitoring the sand movements, sand levels along at 5 locations along the beaches. And this is the only one that actually is showing a continual decline of sand. As far as the other 4 are actually showing an increase of sand. And of course, that may be related to the nature of this protection here. Could be other factors as well, but that could be one factor. If we move along to the Esplanade Beach, there was shortly after the first seawall was proposed to put another seawall in, primarily to protect the Crown Reserve. And this wall was put in 1925 and 26. You can't see the wall in these photographs here, but I just note also all the dunes were completely removed by 1937, whereas they were quite substantial in this time period in the previous century. So of course this left the front esplanade a little bit more vulnerable, and we'll see the impact of one storm in a moment. Again, this is a summary of how the coastal fabric has been modified. We have some concrete blocks through here now. We have rock protection along here and more concrete blocks. Sandbag groins are still in this location. The boat ramp was put in the 1970s, and we also have a car park there. This is probably a little bit similar to the last cell. The shore profile has changed from what was probably a very sloping shore. Progressively over time, this has had to be raised, and now we have rock in the front there. This is just a quick snapshot of the Esplanade Beach and the numbers of interventions in that area as well. So let's look at the shoreline changes now for the Esplanade Beach, and this is 1949. The beach was a slightly different shape back then, and you can also see this was the planting. The dunes were not in existence at this time. And then I've moved quickly to 1999 because it did stay pretty stable just for time's sake. And then we actually had this period of erosion I mentioned earlier, which caused quite a bit of concern, especially in the area of King Street here. And you can, if you keep an eye on that little area, you can see actually the coastline retreating. This is 2008 and 2012. This is since 2012, actually the coastline has stabilised and accreted again. And you can see this is a comparison between 2011 and 2018. These green bits show that there has been an accreting area. And again, we've got profile lines, quite a few here. And this one in number 24 was installed in 2011 because there was so much concern. And it's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but this is this one here. This is 2011. You can see it also built out there by 2018. So when we look at these shoreline changes, especially on the Esplanade Beach, it did seem to start in about 2004, but predominantly from 2007 to 2012, the beach retreated in the vicinity of King Street. Likely causes were assigned to the lack of sand supply, perhaps due to the training of river mouth. And then numerous management items were implemented, including a sand sausage, you can see there, and the sandbag groins you can see there. And I hope Coast Care don't mind me quoting from their submission, but their opinion was, and I've actually seen this on a number of occasions, that perhaps these items were ineffective in controlling the problems that were occurring at the time. And we'll come back to perhaps the reason they were in a little bit when we look at the other side of our equation, which we're going to do right now. So moving to coastal exposure, storm events are replete in this area especially, usually accompanied by debris going into Soldiers Memorial Gardens, the bowling clubs and the tennis courts. There's 7 storm events in the 1920s to 1940s. There's a less accounts of flooding of the Esplanade Beach, but there is one in November 1928, which I really like, the way it's written. So I'm going to read that to give you a bit of an insight into this particular storm. Sleet and heavy rain fell today and mountainous seas are running. Water is washing over the causeway, making the structure quiver. High seas thundered against the seawall, poured over the Esplanade and washed away 15 yards of the embankment. There is none of the Esplanade visible and only a little of the seawall. The brushwood fence from the jetty to the tennis courts near the Hotel Victory has been destroyed. In some cases, the posts being washed right out of the ground. Foreman J.C. Joy expects if the sea still rages that more of the seawall will be destroyed. So that's quite a dramatic picture of a storm that most likely happened when there was no dunes, which is why it was so severe. And there are anecdotes from that time also about people talking about seawater running down the road up into the Crown Hotel. So let's move now to having a look at perhaps the reasons. What were the possible causes for this erosion cycle? So we did a couple of tide studies and we looked at the tide gauge from Victor Harbour from 1966 to 2019. And we looked at a number of times that a tide was over a certain height. And I'm just giving you one here. We actually looked at about 4 or 5. This is a good one because we can see prior to 2003, there are only 2 occasions in the whole record when the tide height went over 1.6 more than 15 times. But here in this record, I might have to also add here, there's 3 months of data missing from the tide gauge in 2011, which was also the winter months. And so we could expect this one would be up here as well. So what we can see is, I think, is a really stormy period from the Southern Ocean for reasons we don't know. We haven't been able to work that out, but this is most likely going to be the reason that we've had so much trouble on Esplanade Beach. I contacted Dr. Phil Watson, who's a bit of an expert in looking at sea level rise, and he did say, look, we haven't got enough data here for me to use my normal procedures, but he ran a 10-year type of moving average, we'll just call it that. And you can also see there's an escalation in the rate of sea level rise in this time period here. And this is, again, is not necessarily, there'll be some natural variability in that. So Dr. Watson says, we need to be a bit careful when we're saying it was running at 8 millimetres per year, because there will be some natural variability in there as well. So we say all that to say it was most likely this erosion was caused not by sand supply, but increasing exposure from the Southern Ocean, although we recognise these issues are not exclusive to each other. So moving on to, again, looking at some modelling. I'm not going to go over this in any great depth because we've already covered it several times, and I can come back if there's any questions. This is simply just to flick through the storm surge 2050-2100, which would certainly see some recession of this particular coastline. In fact, moving to recession of the coastline, Patrick estimates somewhere between 35 and 69 metres. That's if there was no infrastructure in the backshore, and that would take us back to the Esplanade Road. So in this case, the beach is able to recede at least 20 metres, but then the dune system will be lost and the gardens and car park will be impacted. And again, we're talking about later in this century. If we move around to the Flinders Parade area, this is the routine high water in 2020. Routine high water in 2050 would be going over. in some places because the modelling doesn't show that this is a vertical structure, and there's obviously more of it overtopping when that occurs. And this is the routine high water in 2100, which is almost back up to Flinders Parade. And again, it makes sense if we're adding 1 metre of sea level. When we have descended from 1 metre, this is probably the original shoreline 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. This is a storm surge in 2020. Just remember, this is the rare event, the high event, the storm surge, and this will be 2050, and the storm surge in 2100 will be quite significant. So again, we just asked the question, the assessment question was, what would the coastline want to do if there was no structures here? And again, Patrick came up with a recession estimate of 47 to 74 metres. But of course, we do know that it can't recede. So the impact and overtopping would increase substantially, and sand levels are likely to be lower on the beach, and the beach may be lost over time. I did promise you a modelling of a river. This is the Inman River. You will notice here that we've got a bund or a levee in the caravan park, so this isn't flooded at this stage, and neither would it be flooded in the routine high water for 2050. But it would be once we had 1 metre sea level rise, that area will be quite substantially flooded. If we move to the storm surge, again, this area is not flooded because we have this bund. And you can see some water going into Kent Reserve, and I was interested to hear someone say recently the recent swell action we had down there was a bit of intrusion of water into Kent Reserve. And then when we move to 2050, we're obviously going to be getting significant overtopping, and this is a storm surge in 2100. We analysed whether we thought water would go substantially over Bay Road, I believe it's called, and it would look like it possibly could go over the top, but we think maybe minimally. But we certainly would see some of these areas through here would be impacted. Their freshwater ecology would be impacted by these rising seas. And again, we need to just note this modelling does not include any flows that may come down from the river in a rainfall event and where we might get a confluence. We're simply looking at the impact of sea level on this particular estuary. So just as we come into a close now, again, we're looking at our hazard impacts and risks. So it's probably a little bit understated here, but we have an erosion and inundation risk, I think, in this area, this cell. But we've obviously got some significant impacts on Flinders Parade, the Esplanade Beach and Inman River in the caravan park area. Private assets are unlikely, although I haven't done a particular search of who owns what in the clubs and playing fields. I understand it's Crown land, but there might be some private assets in there. And social disruption we have to say would be significant if we're starting to see this sort of overtopping and impact on playing fields and public areas such as parks. Ecosystem disruption is a fairly modified shoreline, but in places where we do have dunes and vegetation, these are likely to be lost. And of course, again, the shore nesting birds would have habitat potentially lost or disrupted. So we've divided this one into the two minor cells, the hazard impacts and risks. I believe we have this is looking at the Esplanade area now. This goes all the way down, includes the caravan park as well. But we have a medium risk at the moment. Potentially, if you think about there was a certain amount of community concern when we had the erosion that occurred along the Esplanade Beach. If you look through the archives, there's quite a lot of concern about what was happening. And understandably, when we add a metre of sea level rise, we have an extreme outlook for public infrastructure, and social disruption will be quite large as well. So our key points here are the Esplanade was set back 60 metres, but most of the dunes were flattened and removed and replaced by roads, car parking and gardens. Only one major storm is known to overtop the back shore in 1928, that I could find in the archives, which was essentially newspapers. or Coast Protection Board archives. The Esplanade Beach underwent a significant erosion cycle from 2007 to 2011 that was likely caused by a period of increased storminess from the Southern Ocean. If seas rise are projected by 2050, then the dune system can be expected to recede and locations of stormwater outlets impacted more significantly. If seas rise are projected post-2050, the shoreline is expected to recede back to the road, assuming we don't make any intervention. So again, we're talking about later in the century. When I say post-2050, could be 2080, 2090. I think you understand the picture. And finally, Flinders Parade. Again, we've got a medium outlook now because we do have some impact upon public infrastructure with overtopping. And again, we're looking at some extreme outlooks for this particular area. So the key points here are Flinders Parade and Bridge Terrace were set back 60 metres from the shoreline, but significant human intervention has been implemented in the back shore. The storm records replete with accounts of storms impacting the seawall and water and debris flowing into the gardens and playing fields. If seas rise as projected by 2050, then an increase in pressure can be expected on the seawalls, increased overtopping, and some recession in places that are not protected, such as on Bridge Terrace. If seas rise as projected post-2050, seas will increasingly overtop it, making the current uses in the back shore unviable. And again, I'm talking about later in the century, if we had a metre of sea level rise, it would be significant impact. Major intervention, in other words, we could increase the height, may be an option, but is likely the sand and the beach would be lost due to the interventions in the back shore. And so that actually concludes. We can take some questions. Perhaps I'll just move. Do you want me to move straight through to the end, Nicole, or take questions next?
I might. Thanks, Mark. We've actually had a few comments and questions, so I might pause there if you like. So just a couple of quick comments initially. One, just for noting that it's Victor Harbour Coast Care, not just Coast Care. Thanks for that clarification. Also, some agreement with your assessment of the sand sausage at King Street. It was useless. It was way too low and needed to be much higher to have served any purpose. So that's good to note. A couple of comments also around how the erosion along the Esplanade will be much worse when the sea level rise makes the reef less effective as a wave calmer. But then there's a couple of interesting sort of comment / question, Mark, which you may or may not want to delve into, but clearly a connection has been made between how development along the coast can inhibit or restrict or limit the flexibility for coastal retreat. And a question has been posed around whether or not this work can set a standard from which development should be situated from the coast. So I guess like a standard sort of distance or an approach to allow greater retreat or flexibility in the future, or is each coast variable and therefore only case by case and dependent on local modelling? So I might pause there and see what your response might be.
Well, I think what we're looking at is a legacy issue. So these interventions or urban structures were placed into the back shores a long time ago. And I think the Coast Protection Board's done a really good job since the 1970s about trying to inhibit or to ensure that we don't have structures placed too close to coast, because there are policies already in place, even within council development plans, that require councils to look at these sort of erosion as well as inundation issues and take into account sea level rise of the parameters we're talking. Since the 1990s, I guess, is also another key factor where we're really starting to take it on board. I guess you could ask the question whether we should be increasing density along the coastlines in some places, but that's again a policy issue, I think, that is beyond the scope of this project. But we're certainly looking at some of those things when we're looking at the next section of the work as well.
Thanks, Mark. And I think that's sort of where the question is alluding to as well is you quite rightly state it's a legacy issue, but looking forward, do we want to continue to add to that legacy in terms of development, or do we want to potentially, as this person puts, have coastal erosion zones for the purposes of public acquisition of private property to allow for coastal retreat or to prevent land development in these destinations, which are increasingly under pressure for development for lifestyle reasons. So an interesting conundrum, as you well know, perhaps to be explored in the strategy section.
I think that's another webinar on itself.
Yeah, totally, and as I'm sure our viewers can appreciate, when you're talking about values and how people perceive the coast and what they want to happen there, it can be quite fraught, particularly with those legacy issues. There is another specific question, Mark, if you can answer. Does the causeway impact coastal erosion? Do jetties or boat ramps have an impact that can be planned for, or is it site specific?
Okay, so the causeway itself, we're talking about posts. As far as I've had a chat with Dr. Bob about this. They don't really place any make any impact on the erosion issue because they're only just stilts, on seabeds. Certainly, when we look at the boat ramp that's positioned to the right on the eastern side of the causeway, you can see the sand's been building up behind that boat ramp since the 1970s. So certainly those sort of interventions do interrupt sand flow. I'm not making a judgment about that particular issue either. I'm just simply saying it's just observed that that's what occurs. But generally causeways wouldn't actually have a lot of impact on erosion, I don't think.
And just one final comment before I pass back to you, just a note around, well, not just a note, but a comment around the council proposal for a possible path or bikeway between the railway line and dunes at Mccracken. And perhaps just some of the information you presented tonight, how that might impact the dunes, might be a challenge. So Mark, I'll pass back to you to talk a little bit about where to from here.
Sure. I mean, I don't have a lot more to say or add, but simply to say what we've done here is the initial study, which we've seen tonight, and then we'll be moving into the next stage, which really is encapsulated here. We'll be looking at identifying options and not necessarily taking action, but suggesting action. And so that will be certainly where we'll be headed into stage 2. Once this community engagement period is finished, I think around 28th of May. We'll be taking on board any comments, of course, anything that we've missed and some corrections, which I appreciate being made tonight, and then looking at the Coastal Adaptation Strategy, which is really defined in these years 21 to 31. But of course, we look at the long range, and then this is really about what council should do in the next 10 years is what we're trying to target in that strategy.
Wonderful, thanks, Mark. So I might now invite Lee Jeffrey to provide some closing words, including a few reminders about the consultation process from here. Mark, do you mind stop sharing your screen?
Yes, certainly.
So Lee, could you just remind us all about what happens from here?
Certainly, yeah. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Mark, for that presentation. That was great. And yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone who has been able to join tonight and remind them that if they know anyone who's interested or would like to give feedback, this will be up from the 13th to the 28th of May. So we'd certainly welcome any feedback. From here, there will be another round of public consultation. So Mark will be presenting online again, I think probably about mid-August, we're looking at that. So that information will come out and a similar format as this with feedback from the community for that second stage of the project.
Thanks, Lee. So just a reminder to everyone, so this first stage of consultation, which is really around the study and the findings of which Mark's presented tonight, the reports are still available online. If you go to Council's Your Say website, there's a range of links, including to the fact sheets and also to a feedback form. We'd welcome any comments and further questions. The webinar presentation tonight will be available from the 13th of May, but a reminder that comments close on the 28th of May. So on that note, I'd like to thank very much Mark for your presentation tonight. I always find them incredibly informative and I learned something new, and I absolutely love the way in which you go into the archives and get those photos. So anyone who's local down there must love seeing those changes over time, or not potentially, given what some of the changes have been. But also to thank Lee and Kathy for joining us from the City of Victor Harbor. And I also thank people who have been able to join us online tonight. Really appreciate your time, and we hope you stay engaged and provide further feedback. Thanks, everyone.